By the end of that winter, 11 men would be dead in Red Valley. No arrests were made. No trials were held. The boundary markers that started everything remained exactly where they had been placed, rusting into the earth while the snow covered the bloodstains that spring would never fully wash away. This wasn't a story about greed, though copper was involved. It wasn't about madness, though rational men made decisions that destroyed them. It was about something simpler and far more dangerous, the absolute certainty, shared by everyone involved, that they were right and the other side was wrong. In Red Valley, that kind of certainty didn't lead to lawyers or negotiations. It led to what happened in the winter of 1939, when a marked line on a hillside became a killing ground. The conflict started over boundary markers. 23 wooden posts, driven into frozen ground along a ridgeline that separated two mining claims. Someone had moved them, or someone claimed they had been moved. In another place, in another time, this might have been settled with surveyors and documents and tedious meetings in county offices. But Red Valley wasn't that kind of place. Red Valley was where disputes were settled by the men who lived there, according to rules that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with what people believed they could get away with. The valley itself sat in the mountainous terrain of eastern Nevada, far enough from any significant town that the concept of authority was more theoretical than practical. The nearest sheriff's office was a full day's travel by truck when the roads were good, and in winter, the roads were never good. This isolation was an accident. Red Valley existed because of copper deposits discovered in the 1880s, and the men who came to extract that copper came precisely because they wanted to be far from anything resembling civilization. They wanted freedom. They got something else instead. By 1939, Red Valley was home to approximately 200 people, most of them connected to mining operations that honeycombed the surrounding hills. There was no proper town, just a loose collection of structures scattered along the valley floor. Company buildings, worker housing, a general store, a small church that saw irregular use, and the assorted shacks and cabins that miners had built for themselves over the decades. The roads were dirt. The electricity was unreliable. The water came from springs and streams that ran clear in summer and froze solid in winter. It was a kind of place where comfort was measured not in convenience, but in survival, where a good winter meant nobody died, and a bad winter meant you buried people in ground so hard you needed dynamite to dig the graves. The mines themselves were the reason for everything. Two primary operations dominated the valley: the Cartwright claim on the northern ridge and the Dalloway claim on the southern slope. Both families had been working their respective properties since the turn of the century, extracting copper ore from the stubborn rock and shipping it out to smelters in Salt Lake City when they had enough to make the journey worthwhile. The work was brutal, dangerous, and barely profitable, but it was work, and for men with limited options, that was enough. The Cartwrights and the Dalloways weren't wealthy. They were survivors, clinging to mineral rights in hostile terrain, because they had nothing better and nowhere else to go. For decades, this arrangement had functioned adequately. The claims were clearly defined by documents filed in the county seat, and though the families weren't friendly, they weren't enemies either. They were competitors, which in Red Valley meant they ignored each other, except when business required interaction. The boundary between their properties ran along a ridgeline that separated two different geological formations, making the division logical, if not always precise. Surveyors had marked the line years ago, driving posts into ground at regular intervals to indicate where Cartwright land ended and Dalloway land began. The problem was that surveys aren't permanent. Posts rot, ground shifts, snow buries markers, and spring floods wash them away. By 1939, many of the original boundary posts were gone, and the ones that remained were questionable. Some leaned. Some had clearly been moved, though whether by weather, animals, or human hands was impossible to determine. This ambiguity might have been manageable if both sides had been willing to simply accept the original survey documents and work from those. But accepting those documents would have required trust, and trust was something Red Valley had never cultivated. The Cartwrights believed the Dalloways were encroaching on their property. The Dalloways believed the Cartwrights were trying to claim land they had no right to. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had witnesses. Both sides were absolutely convinced they were the victims of theft, which meant both sides felt justified in whatever actions they took next. The dispute became visible in the fall of 1938, when the Dalloways placed new boundary markers along what they claimed was a legitimate property line. These weren't the weathered posts from decades past. These were fresh-cut lumber driven deep into the ground, painted white for visibility, and marked with the Dalloway name. From their perspective, they were simply clarifying a boundary that had become unclear. From a Cartwright perspective, the Dalloways had moved the line 30 feet into Cartwright territory, claiming mineral rights to a section of ridge that had always belonged to the northern claim. 30 feet doesn't sound significant. In most contexts, it's trivial. But in mining, 30 feet of ridge could mean the difference between finding a profitable vein and finding nothing. It could mean years of work or abandonment. It could mean survival or ruin. And in Red Valley, where survival was already precarious, that 30 feet became worth fighting for. James Cartwright was 53 years old in 1939, a weathered man with hands scarred from decades of mining work and a face that showed every winter he'd endured in the valley. He ran the northern operation with his two sons, Thomas and Robert, along with a rotating crew of hired men who came and went depending on the season and the pay. James was known as fair but stubborn, the kind of man who would help a neighbor in need, but who never forgot a slight. He'd built the Cartwright claim from nothing, working ground that previous owners had abandoned as worthless, and he'd made it profitable through sheer determination and refusal to quit. The land was his life. The mine was his legacy. The idea that someone might take even a small piece of it was intolerable. Harold Dalloway was 47, younger than Cartwright, but no less committed to his claim. He'd inherited the southern operation from his father and had expanded it through careful management and smart investment in equipment. Harold had 3 sons of his own, George, William, and Samuel, and a vision of building something that would sustain the family for generations. He was educated, more so than most men in Red Valley, and he understood the legal aspect of property rights in ways that gave him confidence. When he placed those boundary markers in the fall of 1938, he'd done so based on documents and surveys that he believed were irrefutable. The Cartwrights' objection struck him as ignorant obstinacy, the kind of thing that could be resolved once they saw the paperwork. But the paperwork didn't resolve anything. James Cartwright looked at Harold Dalloway's documents and saw manipulation. He saw selective interpretation of old surveys. He saw a man using education and legal language to steal what hard work had earned. When Cartwright challenged the markers, Dalloway responded with more documents, more explanations, more evidence that from his perspective made the situation crystal clear. To Cartwright, this only confirmed what he already believed, that Dalloway was trying to lawyer his way into taking Cartwright land. In November 1938, James Cartwright removed the Dalloway markers and replaced them with his own, set 30 feet back along what he claimed was a legitimate boundary. He didn't hide what he'd done. He told everyone in Red Valley exactly why he'd done it. The Dalloways were thieves. The markers were fraudulent. He was protecting what was his. When word reached Harold Dalloway, his response was equally direct. He drove up to the disputed ridge with his sons, pulled out Cartwright's markers, and replaced them with new Dalloway posts driven even deeper into the ground. Then he went to the general store and announced that anyone who interfered with those markers would face legal action. This was the pattern that established itself over the winter months. Markers would be placed. Markers would be removed. Each side would announce their position to anyone who would listen. The dispute became the dominant topic of conversation in Red Valley, with every resident forced to choose a side or pretend they didn't have an opinion. Neutrality was difficult in a place that's small, where everyone knew everyone and social pressure was constant. If you worked for the Cartwrights, you supported the Cartwrights. If you traded with the Dalloways, you supported the Dalloways. There was no middle ground because the community's structure didn't allow for middle ground. What made the situation dangerous wasn't the dispute itself, but the community's response to it. In Red Valley, there was no external authority to appeal to. The sheriff was too far away to care about a boundary dispute between minors. The courts were inaccessible, expensive, and widely distrusted. The few community leaders who might have mediated, the store owner, the church minister, had no real power and no desire to get involved in something that could turn violent. Everyone in Red Valley understood that conflicts didn't get resolved through official channels. They got resolved through force, or they didn't get resolved at all. By January 1939, the Marker War had been going on for 2 months. Neither side had given ground. Neither side had shown any willingness to compromise. The dispute had evolved from a property issue into a matter of pride and reputation. Backing down would mean admitting you were wrong, and admitting you were wrong in Red Valley meant accepting that you were weak, that you could be pushed around, that your claim to anything, land, respect, safety, was negotiable. Neither James Cartwright nor Harold Dalloway could afford that perception, so they escalated. The escalation began with sabotage. In late January, several Cartwright mining tools went missing from a storage shed. The tools were found a week later, dumped in a ravine a mile from the Cartwright property. James Cartwright blamed the Dalloways. There was no proof, but proof wasn't required. The message was clear. If you cross us, we can hurt you in ways that don't involve the disputed ridge. The Cartwrights responded by damaging a section of road that the Dalloways used to transport or making it impassable until repairs were made. Again, no proof. Again, no ambiguity about who was responsible. This phase of the conflict lasted through early February. Tools disappeared. Equipment was vandalized. Supplies went missing. Both sides lost time and money. But more importantly, both sides lost any remaining tolerance for the situation. The adults knew what was happening. The workers knew what was happening. Even the children knew something dangerous was building in the valley, though they might not have understood exactly what form that danger would take. There was a tension in Red Valley that winter that felt physical, like the air itself was waiting for something to break. The breaking point came on February 18, 1939. Thomas Cartwright, James's oldest son, was working alone on the northern ridge, inspecting a shaft entrance that had partially collapsed during the previous night's snowfall. It was late afternoon, cold enough that breath hung visible in the air, and Thomas was focused on clearing debris from the shaft opening when someone shot him. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. Thomas didn't see the shooter. He didn't see anyone. He heard the crack of the rifle shot echoing off the rocks, felt the impact, and then lay in the snow trying to understand what had just happened. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was serious enough that he couldn't stand, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but lie there bleeding while the cold worked its way through his clothes and into his bones. He would have died there if Robert Cartwright hadn't come looking for him an hour later, found him unconscious in the snow, and gotten him back to their father's house. Thomas survived, but the shooting changed everything. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't theft. This was attempted murder, and everyone in Red Valley knew it. The Cartwrights didn't need proof to know who was responsible. The shooting had happened on the disputed ridge. The shooter had used a rifle. The Dalloways had rifles. The logic was simple, circular, and absolutely convincing to anyone who already believed the Dalloways were the aggressors. James Cartwright's response was immediate. He gathered his sons as workers, and anyone else in Red Valley who owed him loyalty or feared crossing him. He armed them with whatever weapons were available, rifles, shotguns, revolvers, and announced that the Dalloways would answer for what they'd done. There would be no sheriff. There would be no investigation. There would be justice as Red Valley understood it, delivered by the people who lived there and enforced by whatever means were necessary. Harold Dalloway denied any involvement in the shooting. He claimed he and his sons had been working in their mine all day, that none of them had been near the northern ridge, that the Cartwrights were using this incident as an excuse to attack. His denials meant nothing. In Red Valley, truth wasn't determined by evidence. It was determined by what people chose to believe. And what the Cartwrights believed was that the Dalloways had tried to kill Thomas and needed to be held accountable. The violence that followed wasn't spontaneous. It was organized, methodical, and executed with the kind of planning that only happens when people have time to think through what they're about to do and decide to do it anyway. The Cartwrights weren't acting in rage. They were acting in certainty, with the conviction that they were enforcing a kind of justice that the official system had failed to provide. On the night of February 20th, James Cartwright led a group of 7 men to the Dalloway property. They didn't hide their approach. They drove their trucks with headlights on, making enough noise that the Dalloways would hear them coming. This wasn't an ambush. This was a confrontation, and the Cartwrights wanted it to be clear who was delivering it. Harold Dalloway met them outside his house with his 3 sons and 2 workers. Both sides were armed. Both sides were ready for violence. For several minutes, they stood there in the darkness shouting accusations at each other, while the February wind blew snow across the valley floor. James Cartwright demanded that the Dalloways admit what they'd done and leave Red Valley. Harold Dalloway refused, insisting he had every right to be there and that the Cartwrights were the ones who should leave. The argument went nowhere because neither side was interested in resolution. They were interested in justifying what came next. Someone fired. Later, both sides would claim the other shot first, and maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the shooting was inevitable the moment both groups decided to meet with loaded weapons. The first shot triggered a response, and the response triggered more shooting. And within seconds, the night was full of muzzle flashes, and the crack of rifles, and the shouting of men who could barely see what they were shooting at. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, 2 men were dead. William Dalloway, Harold's middle son, had been hit in the chest and died instantly. One of the Cartwright workers, a man named Frank Morrison, had been shot in the head while trying to take cover behind a truck. 3 others were wounded, including Harold Dalloway himself, who took a bullet through his leg that would leave him permanently disabled. The Cartwrights retreated. They loaded their wounded into trucks and drove back to their property, while the Dalloways did the same. There was no pursuit. Both sides were too shocked, too focused on survival, to think about continuing the fight. They would bury their dead and treat their wounded and try to make sense of what had just happened. But making sense of it was impossible, because once shooting starts, sense becomes irrelevant. You might think that 2 deaths would end the conflict, that people would recognize they'd gone too far and find some way to de-escalate. But Red Valley didn't work that way. Death didn't create resolution. It created obligation. William Dalloway was dead, killed by Cartwright guns on Dalloway property. Frank Morrison was dead, killed in what the Cartwrights saw as a defensive action against Dalloway aggression. Both sides now had grievances that went beyond property boundaries. Both sides had losses that demanded retaliation. The community fractured completely. People who had remained neutral were forced to pick sides or leave the valley entirely. Several families packed their belongings and departed within days, unwilling to stay in a place that had become a war zone. Those who remained armed themselves and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was a series of ambushes and attacks that turned Red Valley into a killing ground. The Dalloways struck first, 3 days after the initial firefight. They caught Robert Cartwright alone on a supply run to the general store and shot him from behind cover, hitting him twice before he could reach his truck. Robert survived, but barely, and only because the store owner risked his own life to drag him inside and stop the bleeding. The Cartwrights retaliated by burning a Dalloway equipment shed, destroying thousands of dollars worth of mining supplies and tools. The Dalloways responded by ambushing a Cartwright work crew, killing 1 man and wounding 2 others. The Cartwrights hunted down a Dalloway associate and beat him nearly to death, leaving him on the side of the road as a warning. This wasn't warfare. It was extermination. Each side was trying to destroy the other completely, to eliminate the threat by eliminating the people who posed it. The attacks came without pattern or warning. Men were shot while working. Buildings were burned in the night. Vehicles were sabotaged. The violence spread beyond the 2 families to include anyone associated with them, anyone who worked for them, anyone who had taken their side in the dispute. By early March, 11 men were dead and twice that many were wounded. The rest of Red Valley watched in horror and did nothing. The few who might have intervened were too afraid. The store owner closed his business and left. The church minister tried to call for peace and was ignored by both sides. The workers who hadn't picked a side fled the valley, abandoning jobs and homes rather than risk becoming casualties. Red Valley was dying, consumed by a conflict that had started over 30 feet of property line and metastasized into something that couldn't be stopped or reasoned with. The end came in mid-March, when the winter weather finally broke enough that word of violence reached the outside world. A supply driver who'd been turned away from Red Valley reported the situation to authorities in Elko, and the county sheriff organized a response. A dozen deputies and state law enforcement officers made the journey to the valley, arriving to find a community that had been at war for nearly a month. What they found was devastation. Burned buildings, Abandoned properties. Graves that had been hastily dug in ground still half frozen. The survivors were traumatized, exhausted, barely able to explain what happened or why. The Cartwrights and Dalloways had both lost members. Both families were destroyed financially, their mines abandoned, their equipment ruined or stolen. The boundary markers that had started everything were still there on the ridge, some leaning, some broken, all of them meaningless now. The authorities tried to investigate. They interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, attempted to determine who had done what and who could be held legally responsible. But the investigation went nowhere. The survivors wouldn't talk, or couldn't talk, or gave contradictory accounts that were impossible to verify. Physical evidence was limited and inconclusive. The killings had happened over the course of weeks in remote locations with no witnesses except the people involved, and those people had no interest in cooperating with law enforcement. In the end, no arrests were made. No charges were filed. The authorities concluded that while multiple homicides had clearly occurred, proving who was responsible for any specific killing was impossible. Both sides had participated in the violence. Both sides had committed crimes. Prosecuting one without prosecuting the other would be unjust, and prosecuting both was impractical given a lack of evidence and witnesses willing to testify. The legal system, such as it was, simply gave up. The case was filed away. The reports were written and archived. The survivors were told they were free to go, and most of them did. The Cartwrights left Red Valley. The Dalloways left Red Valley. The few remaining residents who had no direct connection to either family gradually abandoned their properties and moved elsewhere. By the end of 1939, Red Valley was essentially empty, a collection of deteriorating structures and played-out mines in a valley that nobody wanted anymore. The mines themselves were never reopened. The copper deposits that had seemed so valuable turned out to be marginal at best, barely worth the cost of extraction, even before the violence made continued operation impossible. The companies that held mineral rights to the area simply walked away, writing off their investments and moving on to more promising locations. The buildings rotted. The roads washed out. The valley returned to the wilderness it had been before the miners arrived. If you go to Red Valley today, you'll find almost nothing. A few foundation stones, some collapsed mine entrances, the scattered remnants of wooden structures that have mostly been reclaimed by weather and time. The ridge where the boundary dispute began is still there, of course, visible from certain angles if you know where to look. The markers are long gone, but the ground where they stood remains, a strip of barren rock and dirt that 11 men died over and that nobody has claimed since. There's no memorial in Red Valley. No marker explaining what happened there or acknowledging the people who died. The historical records are sparse and contradictory, scattered across archives in different counties with no central narrative to tie them together. Most people in Nevada have never heard of Red Valley or the killings that occurred there. Even in Elko, the nearest significant town, the story is barely remembered, reduced to a footnote about violence in the mining era and the difficulties of law enforcement in isolated communities. The few accounts that do exist focus on brutality of the violence or the failure of the justice system, but they miss the essential truth of what happened. Red Valley wasn't destroyed by greed or madness, or even by the violence itself. It was destroyed by certainty, by two groups of people who were absolutely convinced they were right and that the other side was wrong, and who let that certainty drive them to actions they couldn't reverse. James Cartwright died in 1947 in a small town in Idaho where he'd moved after leaving Red Valley. He never spoke publicly about what happened there. His surviving son, Robert, lived into the 1980s and occasionally gave interviews to local historians, but his accounts were vague and defensive, focused more on justifying the Cartwright actions and explaining them. He maintained until his death that the Dalloways had been the aggressors and that his family had only defended themselves. Harold Dalloway survived his injuries but never recovered from them. The bullet wound in his leg became infected, and although he avoided amputation, he walked with severe limp for the rest of his life. He moved to California with his surviving sons and tried to restart his mining career, but the trauma of Red Valley had broken something in him. He died in 1953, and according to his obituary, he never mentioned the killings to anyone outside his immediate family. The workers who survived scattered across the western states, carrying the story with them but rarely telling it. In the decades that followed, a few of them gave statements to researchers or journalists who were investigating the history of mining violence in Nevada, but their accounts were fragmentary and often contradicted each other. Everyone remembered the fear. Everyone remembered the shooting. But nobody could quite explain how a dispute over property boundaries had escalated into organized killing, or why nobody had stopped it before it went that far. The simple answer is that nobody could stop it. Red Valley existed in a legal and social vacuum where authority was absent and community norms were insufficient to contain violence once it started. The isolation that had made the valley viable as a mining operation, the distance from government oversight, the freedom from regulation, also made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of conflict that destroyed it. Without external authority to appeal to and without internal mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully, the community had no way to prevent determined men from killing each other. The boundary dispute itself was never officially resolved. The survey documents that both sides had used to justify their positions were examined by county officials after the violence ended, and consensus was that both families had legitimate claims to different interpretations of the original survey. The ambiguity that had sparked the conflict was real. Either family could have made a legal case for their boundary markers. Either family could have won in court if they'd been willing to pursue litigation instead of violence. But litigation requires patience and money, and a willingness to accept outcomes you don't like. It requires believing that the system will produce justice, even when it takes years to do so. The Cartwrights and Dalloways didn't have that belief. They believed in direct action and immediate results, in settling disputes the way their fathers and grandfathers had settled them, through force and intimidation and the demonstration of strength. That approach had worked for them in the past. It had resolved conflicts and established hierarchies and maintained order in a place where order was always fragile. But when both sides used the same approach simultaneously, when neither side was willing to back down or compromise, the result wasn't order. It was catastrophe. The question that remains, the question that nobody involved could adequately answer, is whether it had to happen that way. Could the violence have been prevented? Could the conflict have been resolved peacefully if different decisions had been made at different points? The answer is probably yes, but only if you imagine a Red Valley that was fundamentally different from the one that actually existed. A Red Valley with stronger social institutions, with more trust between community members, with access to effective law enforcement and dispute resolution mechanisms. But that wasn't Red Valley. Red Valley was isolated, insular, and organized around principles of self-reliance that made cooperation difficult and compromise nearly impossible. The killings weren't aberrant. They were the logical conclusion of how Red Valley operated, the inevitable result of building a community on principles that valorize strength over cooperation and individual will over collective good. The men who died there weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, who believed they were protecting what was theirs, who convinced themselves that violence was justified because the alternative was surrender. They were wrong, but their wrongness wasn't unique. It was the same wrongness that has destroyed communities throughout history. Whenever people decide that their certainty matters more than human life, the valley itself remains. The mountains haven't changed. The copper deposits are still there in rock, worthless now but permanent. The ridge where the boundary dispute began still divides the north side from the south, a natural feature that human conflict briefly made significant and then abandoned. In summer, grass grows over the old roads. In winter, snow covers everything, creating a blank landscape that shows no evidence of what happened there. Nobody lives in Red Valley now. There's nothing to live for and nothing to return to. The few people who remember the place remember it as a warning, a story about what happens when disputes aren't resolved and grievances aren't addressed and violence is chosen over every other option. But even that remembering is fading. The people who were there are nearly all dead now. Their children know fragments of the story, but not the full narrative. Their grandchildren know nothing at all. In another generation, Red Valley will be completely forgotten. The historical records will remain in archives, but nobody will read them. The site will continue to decay until even the physical evidence disappears. The story will become one more piece of obscure history, filed away and ignored, known only to specialists who study mining history or frontier violence. The men who died there will be reduced to names and documents, dates on death certificates, statistics in studies about law enforcement in isolated communities. This is what happens to violence when it becomes history. It loses its weight, its immediacy, its horror. It becomes a story, and stories can be filed away or forgotten or reinterpreted until they mean something different from what actually occurred. But the violence itself was real. The fear was real. The decisions that led to 11 deaths were made by real people who believed they were doing the right thing, who convinced themselves that killing was justified, who chose to destroy their community rather than compromise their position in a property dispute. That's what Red Valley teaches, if it teaches anything, that certainty is dangerous, that isolation breeds violence, that communities without mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution eventually destroy themselves, that 30 feet of boundary line can become worth more than human life if you convince yourself that principles matter more than people, that men who believe they're defending their rights can commit atrocities and then go home and sleep at night, convinced they did what was necessary. The markers are gone now. The boundary they defined is meaningless. The ridge is just a ridge, unremarkable and unremembered. But for a few weeks in 1939, that line mattered more than anything else in the world to the people who lived in Red Valley. It mattered enough to kill for. It mattered enough to die for. It mattered enough to destroy everything they'd built and force them to leave the place they called home. And when they left, when the violence finally ended and survivors scattered other towns and other lives, the ridge remained exactly where it had always been. The copper was still in the ground. The valley was still there, empty now but unchanged. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been gained. The only difference was that 11 men were dead and a community was destroyed, all over a dispute that never needed to happen and a boundary that never needed to be fought over. That's what remained. Not justice. Not resolution. Not even clarity about who was right or who was wrong. Just loss, permanent and irreversible, scattered across a valley that nobody wanted anymore, and that history barely remembers. Just silence where there used to be voices. Just emptiness where there used to be life. Just a story about how ordinary people in an ordinary place made terrible decisions and paid prices they never should have had to pay. Red Valley exists now only as a location on old maps and a file in dusty archives. The people who lived there are gone. The buildings they inhabited are gone. The mines they worked are collapsed and flooded. The boundary markers that started everything have rotted away to nothing. All that remains is the land itself, indifferent to what happened there, waiting for the day when even the memory of the violence is completely erased and the valley becomes just another empty place in a landscape full of empty places. That day is coming. Maybe it's already here. Red Valley is forgotten now by almost everyone. The killings are unremembered. The people who died are nameless to anyone outside their immediate descendants. The conflict that consumed them is reduced to a brief mention in a few obscure texts about mining history or frontier violence. Soon even that will be gone, and Red Valley will be nothing more than a geographic feature, a name on a map that nobody uses, a place where something happened once but nobody remembers what. This is how history works. Not everything is remembered. Not everything matters to anyone except the people who lived through it. Most of the past is lost simply because nobody cares enough to preserve it, because the stories are too small, or too ordinary, or too uncomfortable to keep telling. Red Valley's story is all of those things. It's small because only a handful of people were involved. It's ordinary because boundary disputes and mining violence were common in that era and that region. It's uncomfortable because it shows how quickly civilized people can become killers when circumstances push them in that direction. So the story fades. The details blur. The names are forgotten. Red Valley becomes a ghost story, then a rumor, then nothing at all. The land endures because land always endures, but the human story inscribed on that land disappears, erased by time and neglect and the simple fact that nobody living has a reason to care about what happened there almost a century ago. But for the people who were there, for the men who died and the families who lost them, Red Valley wasn't a small story or an ordinary tragedy. It was everything. It was their lives and their futures and their certainty that they were right and the other side was wrong. It was a violence that destroyed them and the choices that led to that violence and the knowledge that it didn't have to happen but did anyway. They carried that knowledge with them when they left the valley, and they carried it to their graves. And now even that is gone. All that's left is the valley itself, the ridge, the copper in the rock, the space where a community used to be. And somewhere in that space, scattered and unmarked, are the places where 11 men died over a boundary line that nobody remembers and that never mattered to anyone except the people who killed and died over it. Nothing was ever officially solved. The case remains open in the technical sense, but nobody is investigating and nobody ever will. The records exist, but they tell an incomplete story with no clear resolution and no satisfying conclusion. The survivors who could provide answers are dead. The physical evidence has deteriorated beyond usefulness. The truth of what happened in Red Valley has been lost to time and silence, and the simple fact that the people involved had no interest in preserving it. What remains is this: a valley where violence occurred, where men killed each other over principles they believed or were dying for, where a community destroyed itself because it had no way to resolve conflict except through force. The details are murky. The specifics are disputed. The clear narrative that would make sense of it all doesn't exist and never will. But the result is clear enough. 11 men dead, a community scattered, a place abandoned, and a boundary line that still divides a ridge into north and south, visible now only to someone who knows where to look and cares enough to notice. Most people don't. Most people never will. Red Valley is forgotten, and the men who died there are forgotten with it, and the violence that consumed them has faded into the obscurity that claims most human tragedy eventually. The markers are gone. The boundary is meaningless. The valley is empty. That's what's left. That's all that's left. But the story doesn't end with an empty valley and forgotten graves. It ends with the people who survived, who carried Red Valley with them for the rest of their lives, who never escaped what happened there no matter how far they traveled or how hard they tried to forget. Thomas Cartwright, the man whose shooting had triggered the escalation, lived until 1982. He moved to Oregon after leaving Red Valley and worked in timber mills for the next 40 years, never mining again, never even talking about mining. His shoulder never healed properly. The bullet had shattered bone and damaged nerves, leaving his left arm partially paralyzed and in constant pain. Every morning when he woke up, every time he tried to lift something or reach for an object, he felt a reminder of February 18th, 1939. He married, had children, built what looked like a normal life from the outside. But his wife later told interviewers that he had nightmares until the day he died, that he would wake up in the dark convinced someone was outside with a rifle, that he kept weapons hidden throughout their house despite her objections. He never told his children what happened in Red Valley. When they asked about his injury, he said it was a mining accident and changed the subject. The truth died with him, buried under decades of silence that he maintained until his last breath. Robert Cartwright, Thomas's younger brother, took a different path. He survived the ambush at the general store, but was never the same afterward. The bullets had missed vital organs, but had torn through his abdomen, requiring surgery that left him with chronic digestive problems and constant pain. He moved to Montana and tried ranching, failed at it, tried prospecting, failed at that too. By 1950, he was drinking heavily, unable to hold a job, unable to maintain relationships, unable to function in any meaningful way. His daughter, interviewed in the 1990s, described a man who was physically present but emotionally absent, who spent entire days sitting in silence staring at nothing, who would occasionally start talking about Red Valley and then stop mid-sentence, as if the memories were too heavy to put into words. He died in 1967 of liver failure, alone in a boarding house in Butte, Montana. The few possessions he left behind included a photograph of the Cartwright mine taken in 1938, before everything happened. On the back, he'd written a single sentence: "We should have left." That photograph is now in a County Historical Society archive, filed under mining history, with no context explaining what it meant or why he kept it. George Dalloway, Harold's oldest son, left Nevada immediately after the violence ended and never returned. He moved to San Francisco, changed his last name to Dallas, and spent the rest of his life pretending Red Valley had never existed. He became a salesman, married a woman who never knew about his past, raised 3 children who grew up believing their father was from Sacramento and had always worked in retail. When Harold Dalloway died in 1953, George didn't attend the funeral. When his brothers tried to contact him over the years, he refused to respond. He built a wall between his present and his past so complete that when he died in 1989, his own children didn't know he'd been involved in one of the most violent mining conflicts in Nevada history. They found out years later, accidentally, when a genealogy search revealed documents they'd never seen. The discovery devastated them. Not because of what their father had done, they never learned the specific details, but because of what revealed about the man they thought they knew. He had spent 50 years maintaining a fiction, living a lie so complete that even his family never suspected the truth. That level of concealment requires constant vigilance, constant fear of exposure, constant awareness that your entire life is built on a foundation of silence. George Dalloway carried that burden every single day, and it killed him as surely as a bullet would have, just more slowly and invisibly. Samuel Dalloway, the youngest brother, went in the opposite direction. He couldn't hide from what happened, so he tried to understand instead. In 1952, he began writing an account of the Red Valley conflict, attempting to document what had happened and why. He interviewed other survivors, collected documents, tried to piece together a coherent narrative that would explain how a boundary dispute had escalated into mass killing. The project consumed him for nearly a decade. He wrote hundreds of pages, conducted dozens of interviews, accumulated boxes of evidence and testimony, but he never finished the manuscript. He never even came close. The more he researched, the more complicated the story became. Every survivor remembered events differently. Every document contradicted other documents. The truth he was searching for didn't exist in any recoverable form. It existed only in fragments, contradictions, and the selective memories of traumatized people who had spent years trying to forget. In 1961, Samuel burned everything he'd written. He gathered all his notes, all his interviews, all his documentation, and destroyed it in a barrel fire behind his house in Reno. His wife watched him do it and didn't ask why. She already knew the weight of Red Valley was crushing him, and the only way to survive was to let it go. Samuel died in 1976, having never spoken publicly about the conflict again. The history he tried to preserve died with him, leaving only the fragmentary official records that survive today. The workers who survived the violence scattered across the western states, and most of them took the story with them to their graves. A few gave brief statements to researchers in the 1960s and 1970s, but their accounts were carefully sanitized, stripped of details that might implicate themselves or reveal what they'd actually done during those weeks of violence. They talked about fear. They talked about chaos. They talked about the impossibility of escape. But they didn't talk about who they'd shot at or what they'd witnessed or which side they'd supported. That information stayed buried, protected by a code of silence that persisted decades after the violence itself had ended. One worker, a man named Eugene Patterson who'd been employed by the Cartwrights, gave a more extensive interview in 1978, shortly before his death from cancer. He was 73 years old, living in a nursing home in Idaho, with no family and nothing left to lose. The interview was conducted by a graduate student researching mining violence, and it lasted nearly 4 hours. Patterson talked about things nobody else had been willing to discuss. He described the planning that went into the attacks. He described the casual way men talked about killing other men, as if they were discussing hunting or work schedules. He described watching people he knew become people he didn't recognize, transformed by violence and fear, and the absolute conviction that what they were doing was justified. He described the firefight on February 20th in detail. The darkness, the confusion, the way sound echoed in the valley, the smell of gunpowder mixed with snow, the screaming of wounded men, the terrible realization that people he'd worked alongside for years were trying to kill him. He described the days that followed, when nobody slept and everyone carried weapons and you couldn't walk outside without wondering if someone was watching you through a rifle scope. He described the relief when the authorities finally arrived, mixed with terror that he might be arrested, and the strange emptiness when they didn't arrest anyone. And then he described the years that followed, the decades of silence, the way Red Valley haunted him in dreams and waking moments, the guilt that never diminished no matter how much he tried to rationalize what had happened. Their families grieved, and then everyone moved on, leaving only these pathetic markers to suggest that something significant happened here. The failure to properly memorialize Red Valley reflects a broader truth about how society processes violence. We remember spectacular tragedies. We remember events that fit clear narratives about good and evil, heroes and villains, justice and injustice. But we forget ambiguous tragedies, events where everyone was complicit and nobody was innocent, where violence emerged from ordinary human failings rather than extraordinary evil. Red Valley doesn't fit our preferred narratives about violence. It wasn't a massacre of innocence. It wasn't a clear case of oppression and resistance. It was mutual destruction, a community tearing itself apart through choices that each individual could justify, but that collectively produced catastrophe. That a harder story to tell, and an easier story to forget. And so it has been forgotten. The valley remains. The ridge remains. The copper remains in the rock, worthless and undisturbed. But the human story has faded almost to nothing, preserved only in fragmentary records and the fading memories of people who weren't there and don't fully understand what they're remembering. In another generation, even those fragments will be gone. Red Valley will be nothing more than a place name on old maps, a location that once meant something to someone but means nothing anymore. This is the final truth of Red Valley. That violence doesn't always lead to justice or understanding or even clear memory. Sometimes it just leads to forgetting. The men who died there are forgotten. The conflict that killed them is forgotten. The lessons that might have been learned have been forgotten. What remains is silence, emptiness, and the knowledge that beneath the surface of ordinary places, terrible things can happen and leave almost no trace. Red Valley looks peaceful now. It looks like it has always been peaceful. But for a few weeks in 1939, it was a killing ground, and the ground remembers even if people don't. The earth absorbed that blood. The rocks witnessed that violence. The valley held that suffering. And now it holds nothing but wind and dust and the slow erasure of everything that once mattered to the people who lived and died here. That's the epilogue, not resolution, not justice, not even clear understanding. Just forgetting, complete and irreversible, the final fate of most human tragedy. Red Valley existed. Red Valley was destroyed. Red Valley was forgotten. That's the entire story, and that's all the story there will ever be